Hey guys, this is Phil Galfond for BlueFirePoker.com, and today I'm going to review a match I played against David Singer, my first round of the 25K Heads Up No Limit Hold'em Championship on Full Tilt. This happened a while ago. I'm not sure exactly when it was, but I did record a lot of matches once we started planning Blue Fire, and in general I've thrown away most of them just because want to I want to comment on matches that are fresh in my mind, usually, just because I know exactly what I was thinking at the time. This video, I probably will not know what I was thinking at the time in all the hands, but I do think it was an interesting match, and I know that my heads-up PLO video versus Peter Jepson in the 25K PLO Championship was pretty well received, so I thought this would be a good one to review, and it'll also be interesting to look back and see if I agree or disagree with some of the plays I made and try to figure out the reasons behind them. I definitely am going in readless on David Singer. I believe I talked to somebody, and I honestly don't know who, though I might not have told you if I did, but I think somebody told me that he was pretty loose aggressive, or that they heard he was or thought he was, but I was going in pretty readless besides that, and I assume he doesn't know a lot about me since he doesn't play in the games I play. I know a little more about him now, but at the time we didn't really know each other at all. And I'm just going to assume that he thinks I'm over aggressive like all the other high stakes online players. I think live players even that don't play in our games or watch our games usually think that we're even more aggressive than we are by a bit. I know that's the stereotype, so those are my reads going into the match. I do remember that. So pretty standard pre-flop call, and very good flop for me, obviously. I don't think this is a spot to slow play, especially given he thinks I'm going to be aggressive, or I think that he thinks I'm going to be aggressive. Just the plan is basically check raise, bet bet. I don't think, and obviously get it in if re-raised. He calls and turns a brick, so pretty standard fire on the turn. Against some players, I would be tricky here and check occasionally, but almost never on a board this drawy. With stacks this deep, it puts you in a pretty weird spot if you check raise and get called on quite a few rivers, and it's also just a really weird way to get value. Nobody ever bluffs like that, or almost nobody. I also don't expect him to be floating the flop that often, even though I had the read that he was aggressive. I would have expected him to 3-bet the flop with air if he was going to play it that way. Just a total guess, but I think fairly reasonable guess based on what I know about most players and most live players at the time. So right off the bat, I start to notice that he is playing a bit tight from the button. A bit tight in general. He limps this button, which is, I don't know, kind of weird with stacks this deep. I don't hate it, I mean, with some hands. I flop bottom pair with my 4 deuce. And I think it's a pretty standard check call on the flop. I don't really hate a check raise, except that it gets really sticky against an unknown who you don't have a really good feel for, and you have the read that he might be aggressive. The reason for a check raise is mostly just to protect your hand, and I mean not really to protect your hand because you don't expect to get called by much worse, it's not really for value because you don't expect to be called by worse, but you do prevent him from drawing to 6 outs, and you do have 5 outs most of the time you're called. That said, my standard here is to check call, and on the turn I think it's a fold. Even against an aggressive player, you're never in great shape. I would have liked to have seen myself open Queen 4 there. I think with stacks this deep against a player who might not be accustomed to heads up deep stack no limit, which I mean, at the time I assumed that he wasn't, but I didn't know. I think you can probably raise every button. It's also safe to assume that he isn't using a HUD or stats, so he wouldn't necessarily realize that I was raising a ton of the buttons. On the other hand, I'm sure that at the time I was thinking I wanted to reduce variance. But the thing about raising every button and variance is that most players will realize that you're raising every button, and especially most online guys know that the proper adjustment to that is to be 3-betting a whole heck of a lot, and then your adjustment is to call 3-bets pretty light and 4-bet light, and then you just skyrocket your variance. And I don't necessarily, this again speaking in what I knew about David at the time, which is pretty much nothing, I don't think that he would react that way. I think he would still fold a lot and not 3-bet super wide, probably call a lot, but that's not really skyrocketing variance. I am sure though that at the time I was thinking I didn't want to up the variance, so I was just going to play pretty tight, generally kind of passive. Here on the river, I almost definitely have the best hand. Not almost definitely, but probably have the best hand, and I just don't know how many hands will call me, but I don't really like the option of check calling. I think he's never value betting worse and not bluffing that often. It does feel kind of weird to check fold also. I think bet's just the best play. I think if he did check down second pair, he'd probably call the river just because he checked. So he, might have felt that he induced a bet. So I flop an open-ender and make a standard C-bet. And at this point in the match, I'm starting to change my read on him. My read before was that he was aggressive. It was pretty much just based on what I heard somebody say. And I definitely distinctly remember realizing that he was playing much tighter than I expected him to, and that I had to adjust. And I assume the way I adjusted was to raise more buttons, check raise more flops, just be more aggressive in general. So he 3-bets here, and not a terrible spot to do something, 4-bet or call with 3-7 suited with stacks this deep and not that much in the pot, but he hadn't 3-bet yet, and he's been folding pretty much almost every hand and limping some and raising some, so I was starting to get the feel that he was just really tight and that his 3-betting range would be really, really tight there. So I thought I was just in too bad a shape to do anything about it. I didn't think he would fold to 4-bets often enough. It is very possible that David went into the match with the same idea I did, which was to minimize variance. I don't actually really know his background as a poker player, whether he's more of a cash game player or tournament player. Tournament players definitely always have the mindset of keeping variance down built in. Whether some of them don't even know it, in my opinion, but they just know that proper strategy in tournaments is a strategy that small raises and limps before the flop, checking back a lot post flop, and keeping pots small in general. I don't mean that I don't think David knows that, but I think a lot of tournament players just play that style because that's what they've learned. So here I check behind ace high with a backdoor flush draw. I think that I probably prefer a bet given how tight he's been playing. But here I'm gonna, given how tight he's been playing, I think I prefer a bet. But I don't hate checking. I think it's pretty close. I do call the turn since really aren't a ton of hands that I lose to. I think I'm ahead often enough. I have outs if I'm not ahead sometimes. And most of it, I'm ahead most of the time. Rivers will be tough to play given how he's been kind of tight and I don't know much about him. If he fired the river on this river card, I don't know what I'd do. There are a lot of misdraws. Flush draws, lots of gutters, open-ender. And the possibility that when I check back the flop, he'd fire a hand like Queen 5 of clubs just because, and all those combined, I think makes the turn a very easy call, but the river is a sticky spot because I think he'd show up to the river with a lot of air, but I have no read on how often he'd fire it, and I kind of suspect that it's not that often. He checks, so I just showed out my ace high. And he had 7-5, which is very reasonable hand to bet the turn. I'd expect him to do that I'd expect most people to bet 7-5 there most of the time. So here with ace-10 suited, I actually prefer a call to a re-raise just because, okay, good. My whole thing about keeping variance down, I think that if we got in a spot where I 3-bet and then bet this flop and he raised, I would be completely lost because I don't expect him to be raising worse for value almost ever. But I have no idea about his bluffing frequencies, and given everything so far, I don't expect him to bluff that much, but I'm not super confident in that read, or really confident at all, just because of how little I know about him. So, with my theme of keeping the variance down and keeping pots small, especially since, the more hands we play, the more chance I get to get a read on him and kind of maneuver those spots better. So here's his second 3-bet, not too far in, so I'm definitely taking note of that. But again, only his second, and it's very, very possible that he just had 2 premium hands. Especially considering how tight he's been elsewhere. This is funny, I thought I was going to lead, so maybe I do remember what I was thinking in this match. I think a lead here is good. It's kind of not a strong enough hand to check call. Check raise is definitely an option, but it's always frustrating to check fold 2 overs and some backdoor straight draws when somebody's raising a lot of buttons or some buttons and then probably c-betting every flop. Interesting spot here. I'm trying to figure out what I was thinking. I think I probably was going for a check raise here, and I think it's actually a good play. Assuming he floats with all his gutters. If he doesn't float with gutters, well, actually, if his range to call the flop is a flush draw or a pair, then I think I like checking better. He probably checks behind a 10, so which would definitely call the turn. So I get less money in bad against a 10. If he has a 6 that he slow played, if he bets and if I bet and he raises, it's a really tough spot. In general, whether he has 6 or not. But I put more money in bad against a 6. If I decide to call, which I probably would call, or maybe even 3-bet. And if he has a flush draw, I think he usually would check back. I'm not positive about that. I think probably checking or betting against a flush draw are both fine. But the thing is, if he does have checking plays better against a 10, probably better against a 6, probably worse against ace high, but I don't know if he floats ace high. Probably does. And the thing about gutters is I think if he has 9-8, 9-7, 8-7 here, he would fold the turn almost definitely, but I have the best hand, and he's going to bet the turn with them. So, although now I'm wondering why I need to check raise if he's only betting his 6s, kings, flush draws, and gutters. It's probably going to call everything that beats me. So this might just be a spot to check call and kind of value check call against 9-7, although that seems kind of weird. Sorry, I'm breaking this hand down in a weird way. Other problem, if he has a hand like 9-7, 9-8, and I check call the turn, he might be able to bet the river, especially on, first of all, he gets 10 free outs at the river, or I guess 7 or 6. Depending on his hand. But he also probably can win the pot on a lot of blanks. I don't see myself check calling this river with anything, with Queen Jack on any river, unless it's one that I hit. So, in conclusion, I think I like a check call here, as weird as it seems. I know it feels really dirty for people to not fire second barrel with a hand with outs and then It also probably feels dirty for you to not raise the turn to check call with the draw. But as I think I explained, I don't expect too many hands to be better than mine to be bet folding. Or really any hands to be bet folding, which are better than mine. So unless you felt that there was a good chance he would bet a 10 on the turn and then fold to a raise, or bet a 10 or a king and then call a raise and fold to a river bet, I think it makes sense to call once you've checked, if you've checked. Again, you could probably just bet, take down the pot with good equity, and that's obviously kind of the standard play there. Now I hit the river, and I decided to check. If he had a flush draw, there's a chance it was ace high. There's also a chance that he had all those gutters and decided not to fire the turn, or a low flush draw and decided not to fire the turn. I did expect him to call with a 10, if he had a 10, if I bet the river, and not bet, so I definitely lose value against a 10 by checking. But I felt if he had an ace, he would bet and call a raise, given that he probably thinks I'm an aggressive player, and I felt actually that a decent portion of his range was misdraws, or, misdraws that would bluff. So he bets 40 into 180, which at first I was a little bummed by, but actually I think it's a great spot because it makes my check raise look all that more suspicious. I think I could have gone a little bigger here, maybe like to 270. Maybe that's greedy, but against an aggressive internet player, when he bets tiny, I think he'd talk himself into a call. This is actually really interesting. I do remember very well a hand later in the match where a big part of my decision factor, a big factor in my decision-making process was me wondering whether or not he knew how to request time. I know that's kind of funny sounding, but I had never seen him play online ever. Although I'm sure he played a little, but it was a spot where, I guess you'll see it when it comes up, but where he timed out, and I wasn't sure whether he was, misclicked on requesting time, or that he timed out on purpose, or a lot of things. There's a lot involved in that, but we'll talk about it when it gets there. But he did just request time on that hand, which I must have not noticed during the match, and so that should change my analysis a little bit. Anyways, he did have ace-8 with the ace of diamonds, which I think is a good flop call, but one that I don't expect everybody to make. I mean, I'd expect most people to make it and to play the hand the way he did. Interesting to note, or not all that interesting, but important to note that he bet really small in the river when he hit, which leads me to believe that he's a good hand reader. Given that I bet and then checked twice on 6-6-10 king ace, I think that my most likely hand is a 10 there, since I think he would expect me to bet on the turn and or river with my air, or with my 6, or anything better. Anything better than like king, like anything better than basically a pair of 10s. So I think putting me on a 10 there, he didn't expect me to call too much, although I probably would have called a bigger bet since I'm a station. So he just made a small bet to get a little value out of 10. So I'm making my c-bets 50 into 80, which is a little bit smaller than my normal c-bets. Again, because I want to keep pots smaller in general. He's been betting pretty small all around, raising small pre-flop, and this is definitely the match that I wanted to play, the pace of match that I wanted to play. So I'm happy with that. Here's a spot where I'm not going to fold. I think you can call a re-raise. I haven't re-raised once, so I kind of like my decision to re-raise there. And so far I haven't disagreed with much that I was doing. So that's either a good sign or a bad sign that I was playing well back then, or that I haven't evolved at all since. He folds right away. I think he was raising a decent amount of buttons, and it's good to know that he wasn't going to mess around with 3-bets, seemingly. So I think and hope that I picked up my 3-betting pace at this point in the match. So I flop an open-ender in a limp pot. Yeah, I think it's best to just lead here. I think it's best to lead. I think just a lot of hands just flat out fold, like it's king deuces, things like that. And although check raise or check call are both acceptable for sure, I think a lead just plays best. You take down the pot so often, and check call, now you get in a spot where it's tough to win it on the turn. Like if I led the flop, I could lead this turn and fold him off a hand like ace-6, things like that. Whereas now it's weird to check call, lead the turn on a jack of clubs, although I could certainly, there's no reason I couldn't do it. And this is a spot where if he's a good hand reader, I'm not repping much if I bet. I guess if I bet here, I'm repping a hand like missed diamonds that have a king or a jack, or maybe two pair like 5 jack, 5 king, 6 jack, 6 king, even 9 jack or king 9. So I don't hate it, but if he is a good hand reader, I expect him to look me up here a lot, given that he should expect me to check call with any 7, any 8, which I guess there's some more hands that I could hit, like king 7, king 8, but lots of gutters and some flush draws, some open enders like the ones I had, one I had or lower one. So I don't really like my bet there. I know some people feel that when they have 7 high and they miss, they have to bet. You could argue game theory wise it's one of the worst hands you're going to show up there with, so you have to bet the bottom of your range's bluffs and the top of your range's value. And that's, somewhat true, but that's assuming that your opponent's playing perfectly, and that's a spot where if I think David's a good hand reader, and I think at this point in the match I thought that he was, given the way he played the ace-8, and given that I'd heard of him. I think good hand readers look you up there pretty often, which makes it a good spot to value bet kind of thin. He has been folding really quickly on a lot of flops and pre-flop, and while I don't want to kind of read into that too much, the way I interpret that is that he's kind of in the mood where he's not really going to mess around. He's just trying to play well, but most of the time when he misses the flop completely or has a bad hand pre-flop, he's just not really in the mindset of I'm gonna take some pots down. He's just in the mindset of wait for a better hand. So here at Jack 5-3, two-tone board. I actually don't like this check raise given a couple things. I think it seems like a good spot to check raise. You've backdoor straight draw, 1 over, 2 overs to the middle card. It's a really raggedy board. A board that a lot of hands miss. And I don't expect him to bet his 3s or his 5s all that often, though I don't know. But I think that his raise sizing pre-flop, he raised bigger than a min raise. And though I don't want to, this kind of is assuming that he's not that careful, and I don't know whether he is or not, but to me that means a stronger range than usual. I think it means it's a hand he's happy with. Obviously I can't be very confident in that, but I feel pretty good about it. So I think it's more likely than not that he has a pretty good pre-flop hand here, which makes his post-flop range stronger. And given that he would check back a lot of ace-highs, or some ace-highs, I think it might mean he's pretty likely to have a top pair and overpair type hand. So I think I would have passed on this check raise if I was thinking about that. Though the board is good for it, and kind of my image in the match is good for it. Anyways, he folds, so good play. Passed Phil. Again, 4-8. I think I should have been opening pretty much every hand on the button, as I explained before. But it's definitely a spot where it's marginal edge that I'm gaining by doing it. So now he opens the 80 again, and maybe he just decided that that's his open size. And my read was, off. But you can't really worry too much about when your reads are quote-unquote wrong. if you're playing an unknown and he makes a play where you think 80% of people that fit his description to what you know at this point have a really strong range in that spot, and you make a laydown, then later you find out that he's a super monkey and your read was quote unquote way off, and that it was obviously a wrong fold. That's okay. Your read wasn't off. You just didn't have all the information, and your read, if 80% of unknown people, given the information you had, would have a strong range there, then you made the right play and the right read. And I think that's another form of being results oriented, is not trusting or doubting your past reads based on new information, or worrying that your read is going to be wrong. But you really just have to give the best read you can given all the factors that you know about. Here I flop top pair, and I've been leading a lot, so I think it's a good spot to lead again, in one way. Alright, in the fact that I've been leading a lot and been pretty aggressive and expect him to think I'm aggressive means that when I bet here, I can get value from worse hands, because he certainly puts me on a weaker range than my hand. He knows that my range is really wide here, and that King 9 is at the top of it, or towards the top of it. The bad news is that if he doesn't have a jack or a 5 or some kind of decent draw, I don't expect him to do much about it. He doesn't seem to be the type of player that floats, given what I know at the time. So I think that most of the time he's either just going to fold a lot of his air hands, call 1 or 2 barrels with a jack or a 5, or raise some better hands and call with some draws, and raise with some air or draws. And when he raises here, I'm put in a really gross spot, because I'd likely call the flop, but then I definitely call the flop if you raise. But after that, it gets really sticky, given that he hasn't been bluffing much. This is a spot against like a really bluffy, like a floaty, bluffy player who thinks I'm leading wide. I definitely want to lead hands like this, because I expect him to call me down really light, to float me and then bluff later in the hand, or to bluff right now, and I'm very comfortable calling him down. This is a spot where if he plays the hand, it's because he has a pair or a decent draw, or he's going to bluff me or value raise better. And I don't think I get a ton of value from his worst pairs, as opposed to, check calling the flop, and playing it from there. And I do get in a lot of trouble against better hands by leading, and I probably get blown off a bunch of hands. Or sorry, blown off my hand by a bunch of his air hands, if he decides to play them that way, which I definitely don't know whether he would or not. Very interesting river. I think the turn bet is very standard. If he has like a Queen 10, Queen 9, that hits the turn, and it's going to call again. Same with like a Jack 10, Jack 9. All those hands. Board's really drawy. I think I definitely have to bet top pair for value. I river 2 pair, but now there's a 4-card straight and a 3-card flush, the flush draw from the flop. I don't expect to get called here by worse than maybe worse than 2 pair, I guess. So I actually think that this is a spot where I can check the side, probably even check fold. I expect to have the best hand most of the time, but I don't expect to get called almost ever. So I decided to bet 120, hoping that a lower 2 pair, or I don't know, just a queen or king that doesn't believe me for some reason calls. But looking back on this, I think this is really transparent. And while I don't expect to get bluff raised that much, I don't expect to get called by worse often at all. Again, past me was better, or correct at the time, and he did call with the king. Obviously he has a good price on that call, but I don't like that call, given that nothing at all missed. So unless I was firing, which, I have been firing a lot of flops, but unless I was firing with total air and betting 1/3 on the river as a bluff, which is pretty unlikely for people to do, in my experience. Let me talk about this hand. Pretty unlikely for me to do. or most people to do. I think that I show up with a hand there more often than not. That said, he thinks I'm over-aggressive based on his read, and, the read he had going into the match, and I've kind of reinforced it by leading a lot of flops. I've taken down a lot of pots without a showdown. So I can see his logic, though it's a spot where I'm definitely not value betting worse, and nothing did miss. Anyways, he's getting a great price, so if he thinks I potentially could be really crazy, I don't mind his call. Here, I was thinking about checking the king-queen, but I decided to just bet small. He hasn't fought for a single pot yet, and I don't think he's going to make a move at a bet this small. So rather than check and give a hand like 10-9, a few free outs, not that many with 10-9, let's say 9-8, I just decided to bet 30 and quote-unquote protect my hand. I kind of hate protecting your hand in no limit, but that's a spot where I think it makes sense, given my read that he hasn't messed around at all. I would have liked to see myself 3-bet more than I have been. Jack 3 offsuit's obviously a terrible hand, but I think in a vacuum a 3-bet there would be good, given what I know about him. So I flop a monster draw, and I'm going to obviously play this aggressively as I would against anybody. I bet 70. In a cash game, I'd be betting more, but I'd be betting more with my range in a cash game. And like I said, I'm keeping pots small. He folds, so even though I had king high, that's kind of unfortunate. So he has been folding some buttons and limping some, which is a reason not to 3-bet as much, since his open raising range is stronger than it would be if he was raising, 80% of his hands. I still, given how fast he's been folding and not wanting to mess around, I think that 3-betting would be profitable in a lot of these spots. And I actually think I should be raising his limps. He limps there for 30. I think if I make it 120, he's folding 80% of the time. Might be wrong, at least at the beginning. That's also something that you don't want to abuse, though. Here again, pretty dry flop. There are all these spots where I could take the pot away a good amount of the time, but you don't want to abuse them, because then you lose that ability somewhat, and he'll start checking behind, or he'll start limp re-raising, or 3-betting flops, whatever it is. But I do think that I am not abusing it enough so far in this video. I flop middle pair, and given that I don't think he's messing around much, I think I should continuation bet. This is a hand that you might check back for pot control, given all the straight draws on the board, and against an aggressive player who check raises hands like king queen here, or king 10, whatever they don't 3-bet pre-flop, you get in a pretty sticky situation when raised, and it happens pretty often. Here I'm really comfortable throwing my hand away if raised. I hope. Okay, so he makes a small check raise. And this is really comes down to what I expect him to do now, what I expect him to do on later streets. This is, whoops, went back in the video. But I think that, as I try to find this again, I think that he, on one hand, he has not shown any aggression at this point in the match. He's 3-bet twice pre-flop, not really fought for any flops at all, made a standard bet on the turn when I checked behind the flop with a gutter. So you'd expect his check raising range to be pretty strong here. That said, he's probably a competent opponent, I know at this point in the match, or think at this point in the match. I know now that he is a very competent opponent, but a competent opponent knows their image, so he knows that I'm going to be giving his bets a lot of respect, so he could potentially be check raising pretty wide here. So one side of the argument is he knows his image, so he's going to check raise wide, but given his kind of propensity to not bluff off that many chips, he'll probably shut down after the turn, or after the flop. I'm sure that's what I was thinking, because I'm always looking for an excuse to call. I think, though, looking back on this, I should have folded the flop. Even though I don't expect him to raise a hand like Jack 10 here for value, though he might. I wouldn't expect him to usually, so there aren't many hands in his value range, but I just feel like he hasn't bluffed at all, and so there aren't many hands in his bluff range, and if he does have a hand like, I don't know, I guess 8, 9, he still has plenty of outs, he probably will take it away on the turn or river. I do call, which, I gave my logic for, and I'm sure that's what I was thinking. I don't hate it. And luckily I turn a 7, maybe luckily. He thinks a bit and checks, which is kind of interesting. His timing kind of makes me think that he does have a jack more often than, or that he would play a jack that way, but I didn't feel on the flop he'd have just a lone jack that often, unless it was like ace jack, king jack. Probably not even queen jack, maybe queen jack. So I expected him to have a lot of air here, and I wouldn't have hated a check behind, although I don't expect him to fire river after turn goes check check. So really the only reason to check behind would be to let him catch up with a hand like king 10, hit a king, or, obviously the ultimate goal is have him have 10-8 and hit a 9, and then I have a boat. I think given that, he could have a jack a decent amount of the time there, I should bet. And he has shown that he'll call me down. Looks like he did just have air, though, since I don't expect him to fold a jack there ever. So he probably did have air. Which I will note that he did use his image, and he is capable of check-raising flops with air. And then he did give up on the turn. So, there's some people that will take stabs at pots, but once pots get big, they slow down, shy away. So that's kind of the read that I have on him at this point in the match. That he is capable of making some moves, but is not going to go crazy. I wouldn't expect him to bluff off his whole stack. So ace-king, pretty bad flop. I do flop 2 overs and a gutter, but it's a board that nails a lot of hands. I think the best play here is to check behind. So I do go ahead and bet. Reasoning he's not messing around, so I'm not worried about a check raise, especially since he did just check raise. He just, cashed in on his image just a little while ago, so I don't expect him to do it again. But that said, I think I could just check behind, call a turn, and evaluate on the river. Here, I'm sure I was thinking, I wish I had 3-bet more, which I think I should have been 3-betting more. But obviously I'm going to 3-bet kings. Not obviously, but I think it's the best play. There are definitely times to slow play kings pre-flop, but I don't think this is one of them. He thinks I'm aggressive. He might take a stand with some hands, and I don't really expect him to go crazy on flops to the point where I'm really comfortable getting kings in on a jack 9-4 flop. I mean, I would, but it's not a spot where I expect to get it in against a ton of hands. Against a hyper-aggressive player who's, tricky, great hand reader, and, really trusts his reads, you can call with a hand like kings pre-flop, and then when you check raise flops, let's say on jack 5 deuce rainbow or something, he doesn't expect you to have a hand that much, and since so few hands can play like that. This is actually, I don't like this 4-bet. I'm sure I know what I was thinking. One, he had 3-bet a couple times, which is not very much, which is why I don't like this 4-bet. I'm sure that I was thinking that he is not going to mess around with against a 4-bet, that he's pretty polarized in his 3-betting range, so that this would get him off of all of his air 3-bets, and that since I just 3-bet, I think some players, definitely not all players, but I think some players kind of get the urge to 3-bet you back, and I think it's subconscious, to be honest, because I know that there are times when I've just been 3-bet, 1 or 2 hands prior, even if I'm like 4-tabling and it's on a different table, and I see myself go for the 3-bet in a spot where I wouldn't, or like start to 3-bet, and then I catch myself and say, I'm kind of just reacting. And I do think people do that. I definitely think I learn a lot about the way people think from the way I find myself thinking and being aware of the thoughts that are like impulses that I'm having. Anyways, so I did think that he might 3-bet a little lighter, or a good bit lighter because of that. Even given that, I don't think it's a good idea. Stacks aren't deep enough that I love the play. If stacks are really deep, it's almost never bad to 4-bet. But stacks aren't super deep, and I don't think that he's just shown that he's 3-betting that wildly. Wildly enough for me to do that, to 4-bet. Really weird spot here. He called, which I thought he would just give up with most of his weak hands. Even a hand like 9-7 suited, I figured that if he decided to 3-bet it, even though he had, whatever, 3-1 on his call pre-flop, he would just fold because, he tried to bluff and didn't work. So given that, I think that his pre-flop calling range is really strong. I felt that he would probably shove queens plus, maybe jacks and tens also, and ace king almost definitely. But if he did 3-bet a hand like king queen, king jack, I think he would probably call with those. Maybe some lower pairs. But there's also the potential that he has a hand like aces or kings or queens or ace king and decided to play it tricky. So I check back the flop because I think his range is, I don't know. I don't think that I'm getting value from worse that often by betting the flop. And also, going with my theme of keeping variance down, I wanted to see a turn and kind of get a read on his bet size and timing or whatever, the turn card. I didn't expect him to be betting the turn and river here with nines, so I figure I'd learn a lot about his hand. If he bet the turn with nines, I would call, and then he would check the river, and I'd be able to value shove. Things like that. And I, didn't want to put my money in unless I was pretty sure that I had the best hand. He bets the turn pretty big, and it's kind of scary to me, but I'm obviously calling here and making a decision on the river. River's jack of diamonds, and this is weird. Diamonds hit, but I don't expect that to be a huge part of his range. It's a weird spot for him to bet diamonds that big on the turn, because if I do somehow shove, he has not quite the right price to draw, I think. So this is the spot I was talking about earlier. He thinks for a while and then times out and checks. And I was having a really tough time. I distinctly remember this hand. Deciding, okay, was he thinking really hard and timing out? Did he have a really tough decision and time out? Or did he time out on purpose because he didn't want me to bet? Or did he know what he was doing but wanted to think for a while before doing it? So either making a value shove or a bluff, but wanted to go into the tank for a while for whatever reason, to give off some kind of false tells, and didn't know how to work the time bank. That was a legitimate thought of mine because I didn't think he played online much. So I was kind of weighing all those factors in my mind, and I had no idea what his timeout meant. I think that if he had a really tough decision and timed out, that would mean he has a hand like ace king, king queen, queens maybe, probably queens, since he might think that's the best hand, but didn't know what to do, like didn't know what I would call with, especially on the diamond. Maybe even like an ace jack, I thought was really possible here. That it makes sense that he takes a long time to decide when the situation totally changes. It goes from him bluffing the turn to now him having second pair top kicker, and he needs time to process that. If he fake timed out, that makes it much more likely that he has a hand like a jack, or especially a hand like pocket nines or pocket sevens, or even queens that just doesn't want me to bet. And then if he was trying to time bank and I was thinking maybe he thought that the time bank kicked in automatically, So that's a pretty reasonable thing to think after, if you've seen some people use it. He's seen me use it a few times, and all he sees that when my time runs out, my time bank kicks in. That makes sense with a big hand, in my opinion. A hand like a flush or a set or aces. Because I think, he would just want to pretend he's thinking a long time before betting. Anyways, those are all my thoughts, but in this spot, it doesn't help me all that much because I have no idea what to think, and I'm not really leaning towards any of those scenarios. I think they're all almost equally likely. I think that I felt it was most likely that it was a legitimate timeout because he had a tough decision, and to me that means, it can't be king jack, can't be aces in my opinion, or ace king, or a set obviously, or a flush. So it means king queen, or like ace jack, or tens, or queens, or nines. So I decided to value bet, and he did have king queen, and snap called it, which I guess is not that interesting, but a little bit interesting that he timed out and then knew he was calling. I do think, given seeing his hand, I think his timeout was accidental, and he was trying to make a decision and either thought the time bank would kick in, but he used the time bank earlier, so that's probably not the case. Though I didn't realize that during the match, but he did use the time bank earlier, so I think he probably just forgot to click it, or thought that he was going to get his bet in by then, but was typing it out or about to press it, but timed out, or his internet lagged, or whatever. There are a lot of unknown factors going into that. So it turns out that that was a big hit for me, and I think my biggest mistake in the hand was my 4-bet pre-flop. And I know the reason I did it, but I don't really like it. It's interesting that he 3-bet king queen, or gives me a little more info about his hand range when he 3-bets. I thought that it was really polarized to like jacks plus and ace king and ace queen. But if he can have king queen in there, that means that he's 3-betting a pretty good, strong range probably, but somewhat balanced. Here I decided not to 3-bet with nines. I think that's good, actually, given that he, hasn't been calling 3-bets so far. He's folded 2 out of 2. Obviously, as far as game theory and metagame and all that are concerned, you should be 3-betting nines. It's a very strong hand. Heads up with, less than 100 big blinds. I check call flop, check turn. I don't think this is a spot where I get much value on the river, no matter what I do. He's not going to bluff this river off, and I don't think he's going to value bet a 3, maybe a 6, but probably not. And when I bet, nothing at all missed. 5-4, 6-5, 6-4, I'll hit ace-4, ace-5, check down. Unless I floated with like a 9-10 and bluff the river, which I don't expect him to think I'd do. But anyways, I just bet, hope he has a pair, and decides to call. I think it's definitely the best play. Here I would like to see myself 3-bet. I have not 3-bet him at all, and when I did, he folded. And since I'm saying that I can't value 3-bet nines, that means I have to be bluff 3-betting a lot. It's fun. I really haven't watched this since I played it, so good to know that or bad to know, as I said earlier, that I'm still on the same level that I was back then. He calls, which to me means that he has like a jack-10 suited type hand or pocket pair. He calls kind of fast, maybe like an ace-10, ace-jack. Didn't really consider folding with his hand, it seems like. So, not the best flop, but kind of good for hands like... Well, actually, it's not really good for any, because unless he has a hand like ace-queen, or king-queen, king-queen, everything has a gutter or better. So I think I need to fire 2 barrels here if he calls the flop, given that he'd probably call with ace-jack and then fold like a 4 turn. But I think I probably should have checked, and maybe check folded to a big bet. That is a spot where I definitely like to, when I flop strong, check call or check raise. That's a board that is not good for the preflop 3-better, and generally good for the caller. So I like to protect myself, since I will be checking that board a lot and check folding that board a lot. I need to be check raising and check calling it. And keep in mind that a lot of the reasoning I've given in this match I've been operating under the assumption that he's not a super experienced heads-up player, and that he has some assumptions about me, that I'm over aggressive. He's been not making any moves, and I've been much less concerned with metagame and balance than I usually am. And I'm sure from watching my other videos, you know how much I do care about those things, but just wanted to throw out that disclaimer that this isn't necessarily the logic you should be using against everybody you play. Alright, so here I fire twice, which I think is fine / standard, whatever. Have a flush draw. The turn is kind of a good card, since his 7s, his 10s probably fold. At least it makes them weaker on the relative hand strength scale, and I have good equity when called. It also kind of protects against his hands like 8-9, or his gutters even. 9-6 if he has it, 8-6, letting them see the river and then bluff me, or not really bluff me since I have 8 high, but take the pot down on the river, when I can just take those down on the turn by betting. So now the river hits 6, and given that I think he'd fold most of his 10s besides King 10, Jack 10, I think I need to check this river back, since I think most of his range is ace high, or sorry, pair of aces, the occasional like Queen Jack, Queen King type hand, and I don't think he's ever folding an ace when this many draws miss. 9-8 did get there, but everything else missed. And again, obviously I would fire this river against a lot of opponents, given balance and metagame reasons, but I think against him, this is the check back. I think I'm going to bet here, given how fast and violently I highlighted the numbers in the betting box. I was probably a little bit tilted from the King 9 hand. I know that was still on my mind at the time, but I don't like this bet. I'm sure that I don't really tilt, and I'm sure I had some reasoning for it, but I don't like it. And I don't remember that hand, but I think he's going to show up with an ace there a lot and never fold it. So I think that was my first real big mistake of the match. I don't really mind my King 9 river shove at all. And I know I was bothered about it at the time and even after it, but looking back on it now, I think it was fine. And given, how unlikely it was that I was beat, basically King Queen was maybe Ace King. Those were the only hands I was really worried about, or should have been worried about. Unless he thought the time bank was hit. Anyways, the river bet there with my missed flush draw I think was pretty bad. So good to know that I'm getting a little better, although maybe it just could be that I'm removed from this situation and not upset right now, which I probably was at the time. I check back with ace high, which I think is good, fine, and I called the turn. He bets really small on the turn. To me, from him, given everything that's happened so far this match, I think that means like a 10, like a weak 10, or maybe a 5. But I don't really like raising the turn. I'd rather just call. See a cheap river. Wow, I'm on tilt. That's a pretty bad river call. I know what I was thinking, but I wish I would have taken more time at least. I don't even hate the call, but I hate that I snap called. Unless, I must have been on tilt. I'm sure that I was thinking that he kind of block bet the turn with a draw, so that it didn't raise, and turns out I was right, but all the lower straight draws got there. The only thing that missed was like 9-7, 9-8, Queen 9, Queen 8, King 9, King Queen. I don't think he has King Queen that often. And I was probably thinking that the other hand that makes sense is a hand like sorry, to bet the turn is, like I said, a hand like a 5 or a 10, which definitely wouldn't bet that big on the river, or wouldn't bet at all. But I don't know. I think I am going to run into a hand like this a lot. I don't mind the call at all, given that I think he's value betting a really narrow range. But I wish I would have taken some more time to think about it. Even if I ended up with the same decision, I think that kind of shows me losing focus, and there's really just no reason to take 3 more seconds on a decision. And, a medium-sized pot. He min-raises and I call with the ace-6 offsuit. And I flop second pair top kicker. I think the standard here is check call. Turn is a 3 of spades. This is kind of interesting. Kind of a tricky spot, I guess, if he bets. I mean, which he does. He bets pretty big, so it's looking like he wants to get stacks in. But I can't be so sure about that. I do, I do have second pair top kicker, but I don't, in this spot it's pretty much the same as ace 3 or like, jack 3, given that, he's not value betting anything worse than my hand. So, my absolute hand strength doesn't matter a ton, except for suck out purposes. He has more outs against weaker hands. It feels really weak to fold a hand this strong. There are a lot of draws on the board. Any 4, any 5, 7-8, 7-10, 10-8, etc., etc., etc. Spades. A ton of draws. He could be firing twice with air, like total air, although I highly doubt it. There aren't a ton of hands that beat me, but the thing is, he really has not shown me one big bluff. He hasn't shown me any bluffs at all, except for just a bet on the turn when I checked behind and he had a gutter. So I actually think in hindsight I should just fold there. And queen on the river. And this is, the way the board came off is a spot where against an aggressive opponent, this is a good board to make a call down on. But I think that against this opponent, given the way the match has gone, I think I need to fold the turn. I think I need to fold the river. There always is he did show that he did check raise a flop with air earlier, but that was again just like front end aggression, making a couple moves early in the hand, and giving up once the pot gets big. And I did end up with a call. Tried to tell him good luck, but I'm an observer now, so I'm not allowed to chat. And I don't hate my call, just on the principle of how bricked off that board was. Like, against an unknown, I make that call, almost always. But I really just don't think that... I really outthink myself sometimes, and I think that was a spot where I was so convinced that he knew his image and he was going to capitalize on it and make moves on me. And turns out he really never did, and he really never had to. And it was actually kind of good of me to look back and see that I think I did tilt at the end of that match, which I really don't feel I do often at all. But, I do remember after that match not thinking that I tilted, so maybe I should look back at more of the sessions I played and see if I find the same thing. But I do think that was actually interesting to look back on an old session, so definitely let me know what you think, and be glad to discuss any of the hands in the comments section of this video's comments section. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Sorry I wasn't able to win for you, but good luck. And thanks for watching. This is Phil Galfond for BlueFirePoker.com. Take care, guys.